foreign language. And now they kind of miss the ogre. America is vanishing from the world scene. And they are alone. And they have to calculate by themselves where the balance of their security will lie. For many years, Pax Americana meant that countries like, never mind the Israelis, Europeans, United Arab Emirates, Taiwan, the insurance they wanted to buy was the American insurance group. That was the best insurance. Now that insurance is not so good, not so reliable. Does anyone in this room seriously think that if Russia invaded Latvia tomorrow, a member of NATO, a member of the EU, that this administration will respond by going to war with Russia? Does anyone think this? This is Article 5 of NATO, core article of NATO's charter. No one thinks this. We had Radek Sikorsky. Sorry. I'm Marco Rubio. We had Radek Sikorsky, the Polish foreign minister, say, it was secretly recorded, he said, we cannot depend on American security guarantees. They are BS. But he put it slightly more saltily. He wasn't referring to Bret Stephens. But this is uniquely problematic, of course, for Israel. And this is, I think, why the Prime Minister is coming to Washington, despite the opposition of the administration and many people in Congress, to give a speech. Because every so often you have to break some china and you have to be a little unpopular and a little obnoxious because some points need to be made, need to be heard. Right now, the administration is negotiating to allow, according to reports, but reports I think are reliable, to allow Iran to continue to spin uranium in nearly 7,000 centrifuges. And this is what they would be legally permitted to do. Never mind what they might be doing in a subterranean, clandestine way. That is a bomb machine that we are permitting the Iranians to have. And saying at the time, well, we're going to know. We're going to know how much uranium they're producing and whether they're enriching it to higher levels, whether they're going to have a bomb. This is fascinating to me that the United States, which didn't even know that democratic India was about to detonate a nuclear weapon in 1998, which got the Iraq WMD intelligence totally wrong, is nevertheless going to have perfect knowledge about when a closed society like Iran chooses to break out with a nuclear capability. The administration fundamentally misunderstands what the Iranian game plan is. The Iranian nuclear game plan is not to have a bomb today, it's to have a bomb tomorrow. They want the capability in place to have a nuclear breakout at a moment of their own choosing. And this is another point we don't seem to get. You know, the United States in 1945 raced to get a nuclear bomb. The Soviet Union raced to get a nuclear bomb in 1949. Similarly, the British in 1955 and the French a few years later. But most nuclear powers, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, India, and now Iran, have a different strategy. They don't want a fast breakout, they want a wide breakout. They want to be sure that when they detonate one bomb, there are 5 or 10 or 20 bombs standing behind it. That's the Iranian strategy. Build up a robust nuclear infrastructure so that when they choose to go nuclear, there is no way we can plausibly stop them. That's what the Iranians are doing. And that's what we are permitting them to do with this negotiation. And that is what I hope the Prime Minister will be speaking about when he comes to Washington. And I heard someone say earlier, I guess it was Sam, and I just want to correct him on one small point. Sam said something to the effect that, you know, Edie's concern is that the negotiation doesn't take into account Israel's security needs. That's true. The negotiation doesn't take into account America's security needs. If Iran can lob a bomb 1,200 miles on a ballistic missile, sooner or later, they're going to figure out how to lob at 8,000 nautical miles on a ballistic missile. So we are foolish to imagine that this is simply an Israeli security concern and not an American security concern. So Bibi's going to be coming, and he's going to make himself unpopular. And I think a lot of American Jews, if I may speak frankly, are going to say, well, did he have to do it in quite such a way, and it's so divisive, and it's very important that we maintain a united front between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to bipartisan support for Israel. And all that is very true and good and fine to say, right? That's understandable. But every now and then you have to say that there are things that are more important than comedy with both parties. There are things that are more important than being on the right side of the administration. For those of you who have a long memory, think of this. In 1967, Lyndon Johnson didn't want Israel to strike first. And yet Israel struck in the 67-day war. It saved itself, and what happened to Israel's popularity in America? It rose. In 73, the Nixon administration pressured Golda not to strike. And what happened after the 73 war? Israel came under immense pressure from the United States. In 1981, the Reagan administration was very cross at Israel for bombing Osirak. What happened after Israel bombed Osirak? It got respect from the Reagan administration. In 1991, the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, put immense pressure on Israel not to strike after the Scud missile attacks from Iraq. And what happened after Israel complied with the administration? It was savaged by that administration. So it's worth remembering that every now and then, defying the wishes and views of an American administration in the service of what is right will turn out to earn you something much better than the momentary favor of an American president. It will earn you the respect and gratitude of the American people. And maybe that's This is also happening at a time when Israel's security situation is unique and uniquely endangered. And I'm always amused. Hillary Clinton used to like to say, you know, you need to be, in fact, she said it at a speech just a few weeks ago, she said, we need to be empathetic when it comes to thinking of the position of other countries. I completely agree. I would love it if one day the president and his advisors took themselves to Camp David and said, you know what, Hillary, you're so right. Let's be empathetic with the Israeli prime minister, whether it's Bibi or Bougie or whoever comes next. And let's see what their security situation looks like. You know, Mr. President, imagine you're the prime minister of Israel. You wake up in the morning, what are you seeing when you look around you? Well, Hezbollah has about 100,000 rockets. 5,000 of them have internal GPS guidance aimed directly at you. Hamas remains a robust military organization in Gaza. We just had reports in the last few days that they are training 17,000 new recruits to wage a fresh terror campaign against you. Jordan is teetering on the brink. The king of Jordan went to the United States to beg for military support, which he is not really getting. We are fortunate in the fact that in Egypt we have a president who has his head fixed straight, and thank goodness he is there. But guess what? He's treated almost as badly as the United States now treats the Israeli prime minister. You look a little further on, and Syria is a war which is not eliminating or exhausting terrorist organizations or enemies of Israel. It is incubating them and strengthening them. You go a little further on, you know what's happening in Iran and in Libya and so on. So let's be empathetic with Israel and appreciate why they might not be hugely inclined to immediately divest themselves of their principal strategic buffer against the chaos of the Arab world and of the Muslim world. Oh, and by the way, the Prime Minister looks 10 miles away to Ramallah, and there is President Mahmoud Abbas, now in the 11th year of his 4-year presidential term. And he's the moderate. And he's the moderate. What comes after Abbas? Or who comes after Abbas? And these questions never seem to get asked. Instead, people say, don't you understand? You need a two-state solution. It just fascinates me when people say, well, how do you feel about a two-state solution? I say, I'm in favor of a two-state solution. I'm in favor of a two-state solution if the other state is Canada. And by the way, I'd be in favor of it if the other state was Costa Rica. Right? You know, not to quote a phrase, but the people who insist that we need to midwife a Palestinian state into existence with no expectations for the political culture of that state are guilty of what someone once said was the soft bigotry of low expectations. Why on earth should we not ask the Palestinians to have a political culture worthy of the state? I mean, after all, Kurds don't have a state. The Tamils of Sri Lanka don't have a state. The Tibetans don't have a state. The Wallonians of Belgium don't have a state. Shall we go on? I could go on all night listing stateless people that any Stanford undergraduate has probably no idea exist, except Stanford students currently in this audience. And yet we say, oh, but the Palestinians must have a state. They take precedence. Why exactly is that? Why can we not demand of the Palestinians to be worthy of the state? And what does it mean to be worthy of the state? Well, I would like to see, especially given how Palestine is the progressive cause of this generation and the last generation, and presumably the next generation, I would like to ask all those who are in favor of the Palestinian state, where is LBGT rights in Ramallah? Where are they? No, I mean it. I'm a social liberal. All these people who would go berserk at the thought of meeting a Republican, right, who voted for Proposition 8, right, and go nuts, right? Oh, the idea that there's no such thing as queer rights in Palestine is notional to them. Doesn't cross their mind. Where are women's rights in Gaza? You're so infatuated with Gaza. And yet when they tried to hold a marathon in Gaza, it was banned by Hamas because women may actually have worn shorts. Where is the rule of law? Where is democracy? Where is the rights of free speech? Where are cultural rights? Where are the rights of minorities? They're nowhere there. How is it that Palestine became the great liberal progressive cause of our age? It is not. It is a totalitarian cause. And we should insist that yes, by all means, let's have a Palestinian state, and let's make sure that it is every bit as liberal in its outlook as the campuses at Berkeley and Stanford, and not before them. Now, you know, especially when I speak to college students, when I speak to most audiences, I always try to make a point of making that liberal case for Israel. It's not just a case against a Palestinian state as it currently exists, but for Israel, the only country where there are gay rights, where there are women's rights, where there is concern for the environment, where the death penalty is abolished, where presidents go to jail if they commit crimes, and prime ministers are indicted, and so on. All very important to make the liberal case for Israel because it is rhetorically effective. But what I would offer now, and I think this is particularly appropriate at a ZOA event, is to say that there is a deeper case that needs to be made for Israel, and it needs to be made particularly now when tens of thousands of Jews are being forced to flee from Europe, where Israel is geopolitically more alone than it has ever been since perhaps the early 1960s or the late 1940s. And that's the idea that we shouldn't simply like and admire Israel because it's progressive, because it produces technological marvels, because it's the startup nation, this, that, and the other, because of its virtues. Because the truth is that Israel is also a country that's composed of human beings, and human beings are fallible. And some of Israel's politicians are scoundrels, and some of its first ladies overspend their budgets. And sometimes its military doesn't behave as it ought. And sometimes its artillery shells go astray, and sometimes its diplomats are foolish, and its Hasbara people can barely string two sentences together. Israel is guilty of all those things. You know, people, Eric Hoffer, speaking now that I'm in California, Eric Hoffer once remarked, you know, Israel is the only country in the world that's expected to behave like a Christian nation. It's important not to make the case for Israel simply by claiming it's a paradigm among states. It is, in many respects it is, but it is simply a state. The central thing is to make the case for Israel, not because it is good, although it is good. It's to make it because it's ours. And it's the only thing, as Jews, that's really ours. I want to leave you with one final story, and then I'll go to questions. In 1967, June 4th. Everyone knows what happens on June 5th, right? June 5th, on the morning of 1967, Israeli warplanes take to the skies. They conduct the single most successful military strike in 20th century history and wipe out the air forces of Egypt and Syria in a single blow, and then go on to win the most decisive military victory in the shortest span of time. Almost as decisive as the military campaign we're conducting against ISIS, not quite. But what happens on June 4th? June 4th is an interesting day, because on June 4th, Israel doesn't know that it is on the verge of this kind of victory. On June 4th, what Israel knows is that Nasser has moved tens of thousands of troops into the Sinai, evicted the UN so-called peacekeepers. Israel knows that Egypt and Syria and Jordan and Iraq have signed mutual, quote, defense treaties, which are essentially mutual aggression treaties. Israel knows that Andrei Gromyko has just warned the Israeli ambassador in Moscow that if Israel strikes first, it will be the Soviet Union will come to the aid of its Arab allies. Israel knows that General de Gaulle in France has preemptively imposed an arms embargo on the Jewish state. Not afterwards, before. Let's remind ourselves about that bit of glorious French history. Israel knows that Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, has sent a telex to Levi Eshkol, Prime Minister of Israel, saying Israel will not be alone unless it goes it alone. Israel knows that the United States has failed to bring together an international armada to break the blockade of the Strait of Tiran. Israel knows that a letter that circulated in Congress trying to drum up support for Israel got a grand total of 80 signatures out of 535 members. That's where Israel is on the 4th of June, not the 5th of June. So the Israeli cabinet meets and wonders what should they do. And one minister says, well, what we should do is we should send a cargo ship through the Strait of Tiran. It will be shelled by Egyptian artillery. It will probably be sunk. We'll lose a few sailors. But then we will have an unmistakable casus belli, unmistakable cause of war. And so we will be justified. And another minister says, under no circumstances should we go to war without the aid of a major ally. Well, France is out of the picture, and the United States is out of the picture. So what should they do? Well, at that moment, in this meeting in Tel Aviv, Yigal Allon, who was then, I think, labor minister and become foreign minister in the 1970s, says something that I think is very important. He says, they will condemn us if we attack. They, the world, the international community, the UN, the assorted prime ministers and presidents and elite opinion makers throughout the world, they will condemn us if we attack. But we will survive. Let's remember in everything we do that Israel does not exist to showcase Jewish victimization and victimhood. Israel exists to end it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bret. And so he's going to take questions now. You have two mics, one over there, one over here. So if you want to ask a question, please get up out of your seats and go to one of these mics. Please keep your questions or comments brief so we can get as many as possible. Let's start over there.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak to us, Mr. Stephens. I have a question, a two-part question about pivoting. Two pivots. First, you mentioned that Obama pivoted basically inward, away from America's international obligations, so to speak, cause of strength in the world as a protector. There's some scuttlebutt that you hear in the news these days about perhaps Obama is actually responding as a result of a lot of political flack, was trying to mount some kind of response to ISIL or radical Islam, and I'm hearing it on the Sunni side, and as a result, perhaps is trying to pivot toward Iran and basically accommodate Iran and grant some sort of sphere of influence that effectively is already establishing, and somehow form some kind of perverted alliance against the radical Sunnis. Now, you spoke to the craziness of making a deal with another form of radical Islam, the radical Shiites, but do you think there's a pivot by the Obama administration toward Iran? And then the second part is, what are the implications of that for Israel, and should there be a pivot of Israel to other world powers like India or China?
Thank you for the question. So you heard President Obama, I think either it was with Fareed Zakaria or on NPR, one of the interviews he did, make the point that Iran, and I think I'm quoting him exactly, can be a very successful regional player. An invitation to Iran to be the dominant player in its region, provided that it at least stops short of acquiring nuclear weapons, even if it maintains a robust nuclear capability. And I take it you understand the distinction between nuclear capability and an actual nuclear weapon. Nuclear capability is like having enriched uranium here and a weaponization platform here, but not putting them together, which is doesn't take a long time to do. So I do think that there is a policy by this administration to court Iran in the way, imagining that Iran today could be to the United States what China was in the early 1970s when Henry Kissinger broke the proverbial bamboo curtain and went to see Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong in 1972. That analogy is a very bad analogy because presumably the great benefit of opening China was, well, economic. There's a market of 1 billion people that we could exploit. B, strategic. It was a way of, it was an attempt to contain the Soviet Union. At the time, the Soviet Union was an expansionist and very successful superpower. But who exactly are we containing in this scenario? Are we containing Saudi Arabia? Are we containing the UAE? Are we containing Israel? That's an interesting question to ask, and I don't think this administration has resolved it satisfactorily. I mean, there are these kind of airy ideas that we're going to open Iran. Really? There is no sign that I can see that Iran is moving in a direction, is making an attempt for an actual rapprochement with the United States. In fact, everything the Supreme Leader says tells you the opposite. He's telling the IRGC they need to mass produce ballistic missiles. And you remember Mao Zedong at least had a kind of a peace offering towards Nixon with the so-called ping-pong diplomacy. Where is Iran's ping-pong diplomacy? Have they released the Washington Post reporter? No, they just indicted him on espionage charges. They're doing the opposite. So Yes, I do think there's this kind of grandiose scheme in the White House that they are going to have an open and strategic relationship with Iran, which is going to help them contain a group like Islamic State and then moderate Iranian behavior over time. I do think that within the bowels of the administration that idea is present. I think the idea is completely insane. Now, as to your second question, what does Israel do? I think Israel should be very aggressively opening new relations with the rest of the world. Look, Israel's great patron between 1949 and 1967 was France. The jets, that were used in the '67 war were Mirage planes. They weren't Phantom jets. And then, fortunately, after 1967, we started a relationship. The United States and Israel formed the close relationship they had up until about a few years ago. Israel should be very aggressively pursuing strategic ties with countries like India and everywhere else they can find new strategic partners. Not in the expectation that the relationship with the United States is going to fall apart. I don't think it will fall apart. I think this administration is profoundly out of step with the American public on the subject of Israel. But because it's good to diversify your portfolio. Earlier this year or sometime last year, it turned out that Israel now exports more to East Asia than it does to the United States. That trend should continue.
Somebody over there. If you had a crystal ball and could look 50 years into the future, and there was peace in the Middle East, what would that peace look like, and is such a thing possible?
Thank you. I have a crystal ball. There will not be peace in the Middle East. But look, well, not never. Look, there's a lady in front who just added never. Look, the original suicide bombers were the kamikazes. And Japan's political culture was transformed from a militaristic death cult that emerged in the 20s, 30s, and 40s to this not only Pacific but largely pacifist nation we have today. Core ally of the United States, great partner. That happened, however, only after the shock of the destruction of Japanese military capability. And what you would need in the Middle East is a transformation not of its leaders, but of its political culture. And the political culture is not just political, it's also religious, it's social, it's cultural, and so on. Now, these things happen, by the way. And part of our problem is that we are not working to make it happen because we don't recognize it. I mean, look, this is one of the things that drives me bananas about the whole question about the settlements, right? The settlements are an obstacle to peace. I have all kinds of objections, to this settlement or that settlement and the behavior of certain settlers. But how does anyone with a straight face make the argument after the withdrawal from Gaza that the settlements are the core of the conflict? The conflict is not territorial, it's existential. And this is sort of maniacally denied by people who don't want to come to grips with the scope, nature, and size of the problem. I have a friend who's an Egyptian, very courageous Egyptian Muslim, and he has been quietly pursuing the project of translating core documents of liberal Western civilization into Arabic. John Locke's Letter Concerning Toleration, a number of the Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural. And his point is that the Arab world needs to understand what the philosophical basis of the liberal world order is. And you can't understand it unless you're grappling with these core texts in the Western political tradition. So that's a work that's going to have to take place over many generations, right? You have to, and when Kerry says, well, we need better governance and jobs, everything is a job scheme. No, it's not a job scheme. It's a matter of changing ideas. It's a matter of the Arab world coming to grips with the extent of its failure, of understanding that the reason that Israel has succeeded is that it has cultivated human capital and liberal enterprise and liberal spirit to create a successful society. And at some point, that's got to change. And whether it takes 50 years, or 5 years, 50 years, or 500 years, it's the goal you need to work towards, not these ridiculous schemes that if only Israel withdraws every last settlement and goes back to the 1967 lines, you're miraculously going to have the emergence of some kind of peace. I don't understand how anyone who considers himself intelligent imagines that if Israel were to withdraw tomorrow to the 67 lines, there would be peace. There would not be peace. There would be a new and far more aggressive and dangerous form of war against Israel.
Bret, I'm very interested in foreign policy. I follow your writings, and watch you on TV, and read the writings and speeches of other intelligent foreign policy experts. So my question to you is, will you accept appointment as Secretary of State in the next Scott administration?
Is the Pentagon job not available? Thank you.
I have a historical question.
Yes.
I'm curious as to why the Palestinians, of all the peoples, that their refugee status continues for generations.
Yes, I mean, it's one of the greatest scandals of this age. You have two UN refugee agencies. One is to deal with all refugees, and the other is to deal with Palestinian refugees, which the United States, by the way, richly funds. I don't know what is it, 20-25% of the UNRWA budget comes from the United States. And it's one of the scandals of our age. The fact that the U.S. accepts UNRWA as a legitimate UN agency is appalling and ought to be ended. It's also appalling, by the way, that you never hear people note, especially on college campuses, that at least up until a couple of years ago in Lebanon, Palestinians were systematically discriminated against by the labor laws of Lebanon so that they couldn't hold jobs as taxi drivers, lawyers, bricklayers, you name it. But the Arab world has willfully and perversely perpetuated a refugee crisis that should have ended not years ago, generations ago. I still have dachas in Lithuania that I don't know where the deeds are, but surely they're mine. But I've moved on. And look, this is again a point that people go on and on about. By the way, I have a colleague, wonderful columnist. I urge you to read him if you don't already. Holman Jenkins, business columnist, the Journal. And he has a marvelous line. He says, there's some arguments that vanish in the presence of thought. And the case for the Palestinian refugees is precisely one of those arguments. We have 800,000, as you well know, Jewish refugees from the Arab and Muslim lands who are not expecting imminently to be returned to their orange groves in Algeria or their dwellings in Alexandria. You had parallel refugee crises in 1948, just as you had them, by the way, all over Europe after the Second World War. And yet we've somehow educated young people to imagine that the only refugee crisis after World War II was the Palestinian one. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's a sign of just how the persistent miseducation of generations of young people has warped political sensibility in this country.
Thank you. You've made persuasive cases in the case of Iran and the security of Israel. What leaves me in despair, however, is when you mention the necessity that Israel should be reaching out to other countries in the Western free world. And yet the current prime minister, in a sense, has abdicated this reaching out toward the Western world by maybe lack of understanding of the diplomacy required, but certainly a PR state that is hardly anything that would encourage that.
So the question is, the point you're making is lousy Israeli PR.
In part, I'm really saying the current administration's PR. I think Israel has a tremendous amount of sympathy, recognition, and belief from most of the Western world. And I do think, well, that's a personal view, folks. As many of these are. But I'm just really looking for where the culture of reaching out can be extended from the Israeli administration.
Thank you for the question. So, in 2013, after the election, after the U.S. election, President Obama decided that he wanted to reset relations with Israel, and he paid his first presidential visit to Israel. A couple points about that visit that ought to be recalled. Number one, because he wanted to speak to a friendly audience and get the best possible PR for himself, he chose not to speak to the Israeli Knesset, but to speak to a group of young students with left-leaning views that squared with his own. I don't remember violent objections from the Netanyahu government to the president using a selected audience in Jerusalem as a vehicle to espouse political views antithetical to the prime minister's. I don't remember that becoming a major point of political contention. The president was welcomed very cordially. He was given a chance to speak his views to an audience where he was certain to get a large amount of applause. Secondly, the prime minister was pressured by the president to issue an apology he never should have issued to the then prime minister, now president of Turkey, a raging anti-Semite named Recep Tayyip Erdogan. For which apology, Bibi got nothing from the Turks and nothing from the US. The prime minister and the entire Israeli government went out of its way to concede to the US that it would not attack Iran in 2012 on the eve of the election. In 2014, unnamed administration officials called that decision, which was essentially the decision to acquiesce with White House pressure, as, excuse my language, chicken shit. So I guess the problem I have with your question is the premise is that somehow it's the Israelis who need to be reaching out to the US or to the West and not the other way around. And I think that is a bad way of going about doing things. Israel is not a client state of the United States. Actually, Israel is the best ally of the United States. One of the things that drives me bananas is people say, we're giving those Israelis $3 billion a year. You know?